It is indeed my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kelley Deetz on Bound to the Fire, How Virginia's Enslaved Cooks Helped Invent American Cuisine.
Thank you. I'm pretty loud, so if this hurts anybody's aids, I've been told to turn it off before, so give me the wave. I know what to do. Thank you all for having me here today. It is always an honor to talk about the work that went into this book, to share the stories and the myths that I busted through all of this. So I want to start out by just saying that I'm a historian. I'm an archaeologist, but I'm not just a regular historian, right? I don't just go to the archive and read stuff and write stuff. I actually interrogate the archive. And you have to do that when you're looking for stories that have been lost in time. I consider myself a historian because I testify on behalf of the past, on behalf of people whose voices were not written down like so many of the important people that we know of, which are fantastic, right? But the average person did not write their story down. So using the archive to look sort of against the grain and sort of figure out ways to find out stories from recipes, etc., digging in the dirt has also helped me bring these stories to life. The purpose of my book is multifold. First of all, and I would say most of all in some ways, it's to give credit. It's to give credit to the enslaved men and women and children who were literally bound to the fire in Virginia's kitchens. They were also bound to the fire throughout the South and the North. But Virginia, as the motherland of this country, has a particular relationship with food and with nation building and our nation's history. It's also to do what my friend and colleague, Michael Twitty, says is culinary justice. And this is simply put, right? Your grandma has a cookie recipe, right? She's been making them for the church for your whole life. She dies, and then some lady named Jane steals that recipe and talks about how she made the cookies, and then 2 generations later, they're Jane's cookies and not your mother's or your grandmother's. It's simply putting things back where they need to go. You can take race out of the equation, and everyone will identify with that situation. Third, out of the 4 things I'll be talking about, is also to bring attention to the historical kitchens that still stand. I know that you have some kitchens here in Fredericksburg. I've been to some and they're pretty phenomenal. But these kitchens stand as a testimony to the people who worked inside of them. Not just the white family that ate the food that came out, but those who literally worked and lived within those spaces for their entire lives. And lastly, and I would say in some ways most importantly, and I know many of you probably came here to hear about puddings and pies and all those things. And I was a chef for 10 years, so trust me, and I like to eat, clearly. But I understand, right? But my work is centered in the people who are doing the work. That means I want to tether the romance of food and eating and culinary history to the reality of enslavement. Those 2 things existed together, complicatedly, and we'll be talking about that today. I do not like reading from slides. I think it's one of the most boring things speakers can do. I don't even like reading out loud, honestly. But I am going to start out with just a little bit of an introduction from my book, because when I wrote this years ago, I couldn't say it any better now. So I'm going to go ahead and start here, and then we'll kick in the slides in a moment. Surry County, Virginia, 1860. It was the eve of the Civil War, and Sookie went to bed every night thinking about the labor of her days. Cooking on a Surry County plantation was a stressful task that occupied all of her 5 senses and consumed almost every moment of her life. She provided several meals a day to the white family who enslaved her and to whomever came to visit. Food was more than sustenance. It was at the core of Virginia hospitality. Her friends in the field worked from sunup to sundown, while Sookie remained bound to the fire in the big house's kitchen 24 hours a day. She was forced to cook multiple meals that were both scheduled and spontaneous. Up every day before dawn, Sookie baked bread for the mornings, cooked soups for the afternoons, and prepared divine feasts for the evenings. She roasted meats, made jellies, puddings, and created desserts for every free person who passed through that plantation. Sookie lived in the kitchen, slept upstairs above the hearth during the winters, and often moved outside come summer. Her children learned to cook and work in the big house and were always under the watchful eye of the white family. Private moments were rare, as was the ability to truly rest. She rose early to bake, cooked all day, and went to bed with the next day's menu both in her mind and on the large hearth on the first floor of her kitchen quarters. Cooking for a Virginia plantation was a challenging task, one that required culinary talents, nuanced social skills, and physical strength. The labor was intense, lifting huge pots of water, standing for hours by the open fire. Her workday often bled into the night with no space for rest. Sookie was a typical enslaved cook, and undoubtedly, she worked herself to death. Cooking provided her and her family with a unique status within the bonds of enslavement, but it came at a high price. In 1860, Sookie died at the age of 50 from a hemorrhaged womb, likely caused by overexerting herself for the sake of Virginia's famous hospitality. If anyone here has lifted a cast iron pot full of something, you know exactly what I'm talking about. All right, slide. I don't have a clicker, so I'm gonna have to use my eyeballs. Okay, so today we're gonna be talking about several things. One of the biggest things I love to talk about when I bring this book and this topic to crowds like yours is busting myths. I'm sure all of you, you're on the board, many of you, you love history. I'm sure you've been to plenty plantation museums, and I'm sure you've heard plenty of untruths on these tours, right? So my work pushes it back against some of the things that we've taken for granted so long. It also really highlights the reality of these men and women's lives, how they actually had to persevere in those kitchens under those conditions. And then lastly, the legacy. What is the legacy of these men and women working in those kitchens? So much of the food that we think of as American food came from their hands and their minds and their hearts. And it was all in cahoots with the mistress of the house, like we'll be talking about that too. But it's that labor and that creativity and the ingenuity to create these sorts of recipes that really gave Americans, in so many ways, a culinary pride. So we're going to go ahead and just jump right in with the myths, because this is so fun to me. All right, so this is classic, right? Typical plantation scene. This was also painted in the 1950s, and they lied where I saw this. I won't tell you where it was. They said it was a period portrait. It is not. I'm sure many of you know a little bit about costuming. There's nothing authentic about any of the things, especially the lady there. It's not mid-19th century at all. But you see this image of the mistress in there doing the cooking, right? She's got some helpers, but she's there. She's the one making the food, stirring the pot. She is the boss in that space, right? This is a very comfortable narrative that you hear at most plantation sites, even to this day. And my work pushes against this in many ways. And I'm not saying that some ladies weren't in there cooking, because they were, but I'm talking about the big plantation homes, the homes that were, responsible for diplomatic dinners, for really important people coming to visit. And you think about Virginia and the wealth here and the founding fathers that were here, there was some serious eating going on during those periods. So that's the sort of space that I'm talking about. And so my work pushes against this because it manifests in not just this horrific plantation scene painted in the mid-20th century, but in other ways as well. I'm sure many of you here in the audience have some of this secretly hidden in your house. I know this because I give this talk like once a month, and at some point I'll get a little box saying, "Here, Dr. Deetz, I got something I don't want to put on my counter anymore, you can have it." Now I have this crazy huge collection of what's called Black Americana. But these images were, I would say, one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in American history. So blackface and minstrel shows became incredibly popular during the early 19th century, right when the abolitionist movement really started to take hold in the country. So when the abolitionists were saying, look, this is unethical, it's immoral, you're treating your enslaved folks horribly, people that held slaves in the South responded back by saying, no, there are aunts and our uncles and they're happy, etc. That made its way into minstrel shows, made its way into Aunt Jemima branding, as well as in the 20th century, you start seeing things like these salt and pepper shakers and all kinds of iconography. And these sorts of things, they're subtle, right? But they also really sort of enforce the idea that Black people, one, were happy. Everybody's smiling up here. They loved being in those kitchens. They're loyal to the white folks, right? And they are there pretty much just to serve white people, right? Well, we might not have an enslaved cook anymore, but we definitely have some salt and pepper shakers, so we can nod back to that time. That makes us feel comfortable about what we lost after the Civil War. These are very nuanced, subtle things that people don't typically think about, but they're very powerful. So powerful in that 2020, when 2020 came around, Aunt Jemima retired. She's no longer on the grocery store shelves. But I have to say, I found where she retired. I went to Barbados in 2021, and she's there, hanging out in the grocery stores. I mean, you go to the syrup section, and that's all you see. So she has now landed herself in a country that's 96% African descent people, and I think she's doing pretty well. So these kinds of images also really bring up a strange contradiction, right? Who here knows or has heard of Aunt Jemima? I should have asked who hasn't, and I would drop my microphone and probably leave. So everyone's heard of her, right? And we also, some people know who Erastus is, the cream of wheat guy, some don't. Uncle Ben's another story in itself. But we all know this image. So this image has existed for a very long time, yet up until recently, until my book was published, and even still today, credit is not given to them for making the food. It doesn't make sense, right? So that's part of the thing that I'm pushing back against. This also still exists. Aunt Jemima may have retired, but next slide. You can also see, other slideshow. Doesn't matter. I was sent an updated one. All good. I'll just tell you that if you go to places like the Fresh Market right now, you will see things like plantation molasses. And that kind of iconography might not have a black face on it, but it definitely is a huge nod to the good old days in many ways. So just keep your eye out for that. Okay, on to this. Okay, so we're gonna pull way back here. I was a professor for 10 years, and I did not start my African American history courses on a slave ship. I started before the slave trade. I wanted people to understand who these men and women and children were before they were stolen and put on a ship and sent to labor in Virginia's and other places, kitchens and homes. So we're going to start back to West Africa, and I want to really paint a picture of the kinds of food and the kind of role that food played in these different people's communities before they ended up, in these kitchens in places like Virginia and throughout the diaspora. There was an incredible pride in their food, just as any culture. I think that's one thing that every human can agree on. We all love food, and food represents culture, and that's something that's very important to everyone, regardless of their race, ethnicity, nationality, etc. So you had varying different ethnic groups. You had different, languages being spoken, different religions being practiced, and many of the things that transferred over, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, were common throughout these different groups. The one-pot meal, for example, having food as something that you do within a community, right? Everybody gathering around, eating a big meal together, cooking food in animal fat was something that also you would see throughout West and Central Africa before and during and even now during the slave trade. And it's important to also understand that many of these different kingdoms and queendoms and communities were also at war with one another, right? So when the slave trade kicked in, sometimes you would end up on a ship with someone who did not speak your language, did not pray the way that you pray, did not, didn't even, look at you like an equal in many ways. And there was a lot of tension in that. But the diaspora, the forced migration, brought certain cultural traditions together by force. Transatlantic slave trade, also known as the African diaspora, the forced migration of what is estimated to be 12.5 million captured and sold and traded West African people. That is a very conservative estimate, right? This is a historical estimate coming from written records. This does not include the illegal trade that was happening after the transatlantic slave trade closed. It does not include a lot of the ships that went down in the middle of the Atlantic. So we're talking about 12.5 million people from about 1501 to 1880s, if you're in Brazil, of this forced migration of West African and Central African people. When you migrate people, you migrate cultures, ideas, recipes, memories. That was all actively happening during this. There's a lot of, misled scholarship that's somewhat dated, saying that, they lost all their culture on those ships. That is absolutely not true. You see this distinctly in places, especially like Brazil. But only 4% of that 12.5 million ended up in British North America. So that's why if you go to Brazil today, or a lot of places in the Caribbean, you're going to see that West African culture just there. Like the language sounds a little different, the food is different. You have these strong representations of that historical past. In places like Virginia, you got to look a little tiny bit closer, but it doesn't mean it's not there. So enslaved folks would end up at places like Stratford Hall, which I worked for 7 years. This was built in 1738. It is a beautiful example of Georgian architecture. And I'll be talking a little bit more about this later when I bring up some examples of some myths that need to be busted. But enslaved folks would be brought to a plantation, if you're in Virginia, some are, of course, urban, etc. But if you're brought to a plantation like this, you're either going to be put into the field or into the domestic area, right? And there's a lot of myth around how it was somehow easier to work in the house, and that's also completely not true. So if you didn't end up in the domestic area, you would end up in the fields. Now, I want you to remember what I said earlier about those memories, the memories of recipes of cooking, that communal cooking that was happening in West Africa. If you were placed at a plantation, you would be typically put into a slave quarter with up to 12 or more people in a small shack like this, right? So you would be forced in these little living quarters. You would have what you see archaeologically and sometimes still surviving, these gardens that were put up in and around by the enslaved community to supplement their food, right? If you're in Virginia, maybe you're gonna get a little bit of cornmeal and a little bit of fat back from the overseer once a week. No one is going to live off of that. So it was up to the enslaved community to supplement that with gardens that they would grow on their off time, which was slim, as well as hunting and fishing, etc. What they did in these spaces, I find, in so many ways, genius. Next slide. They developed these spaces that this archaeologist called Whitney Battle Baptiste out of UMass Amherst calls the kitchen yards. No one's gonna, you're not gonna have 12 people sitting in a slave quarter in the middle of August in Virginia. It's not happening. So what they did is they recreated the space that they had in those West African communities where there was one pot and people from the community would bring in food. And so this horrible situation that they were put in, they used their own cultural memories to recreate a sense of home in this kind of space. So maybe, John caught a rabbit in his rabbit trap, Maybe somebody's got some eggs from their little chicken coop in the back. You've got okra growing, you've got these other vegetables growing, and they would make things like what's now considered gumbo and other one-pot meals in these spaces. These spaces were also critical for telling stories of the homeland. These are the spaces that when you read slave narratives as late as the 19th century, you see people talking about, learning about the music and the food of their ancestors in West Africa. These kitchen spaces and kitchen yards were vital to the survival and preservation of these kinds of cooking techniques and community building. If you ended up, and again, to rewind back to the last slide, you don't have to rewind back to the last slide. If you were working in the field and you were of working age, which was really like 6 or 7 until you were elderly and couldn't actually work anymore, you would be working from sunup to sundown. With Sundays off, and what is an off day when you work that much? You're trying to get your food together, spend time with your children, do those kinds of things. So it was incredibly taxing. But that time off, which isn't really time off because they're enslaved, was spent doing that kind of homemaking and memorizing and sort of like talking about history, etc. in those spaces. Okay. So if you ended up working in the domestic space, your life was very different, right? It was considered in many ways as a step up on the sort of like, stratigraphy. I'm an archaeologist, so excuse that phrase. The stratigraphy of class among the enslaved community. But it was really incredibly hard to work in that space. The folks in the field, they sometimes had an overseer down there, but they had time where they felt like maybe they weren't being watched. They could actually sing they wanted to sing. They could do the things that they wanted to do within reason, many of them. If you're in that house, you have no privacy at all. And moreover, if you're a woman and you're working in certain spaces, the threat of abuse and rape was rampant. And I've read this through many, many diaries. Next slide. So So if you were working in the house and you were, say, the chef, I call them chefs now because they would have been considered chefs in today's sort of standards, but back then they were called cooks. You had a very close relationship with the mistress of the house. This is what this relationship sometimes is referred to as carrying the keys. The lady of the house would come down with her big keychain and talk about the menu with the chef in the morning, or maybe the day before, and maybe she would unlock some really expensive spices. A lot of times, though, those enslaved chefs had access to the butter, to the sugar, to the spices, etc., because they were incredibly trusted. These relationships were incredibly tangled because there was so much writing on the food that was being served. All right, I think we're in a good crowd here to ask this question, and you will be embarrassed to know that I've asked this question in the South, most recently Kentucky, and they did not know what this was. What do pineapples represent, please, God? Finally, my people, you know what pineapple means. Drives me insane. I give this talk all the time, and the times that I've asked and people are looking at me blinking, I'm like, you're through and through Southern. Like, how do you not know there's a pineapple in front of the place I'm giving the talk? So anyways, hospitality is something that's also incredibly tethered to this labor, right? These skills. Pineapples became this universal symbol of hospitality because, of course, you know, if you were connected enough and wealthy enough to somehow land yourself one of these things that, you know, was picked in the tropics, and 4 months later in the hot, sweltering summer on a ship with rum and sailors, maybe one wasn't rotten by the time it pulled up to Fredericksburg or, you know, Charleston, you got your hand on this like divine rare fruit, right? And if you share this divine rare fruit with people, that is the ultimate symbol of being hospitable. No one talks about Northern hospitality. That is not a thing. So, right? Finally, some laughs. Y'all are great. I'm going to come back. So, this is so tethered to that history, right? You show up at 2 a.m, you know, from your airplane is late, you're going to get some food. That tradition goes way back to when you could ring a bell, like in Downton Abbey, right? And then the enslaved folks would come out and make sure you're being taken care of. So this is so, so close to all of this. Food, like I mentioned a moment ago, and throughout this, is more than just sustenance. It was a way for the mistress to flex their domestic power, right? Just like today, if you're, you know, going to put some money down and throw a Christmas party, you want that food to be good. You don't want some nasty 3-day-old deviled eggs. You don't want some, you know, something that everyone's been making fun of you for. You want to make sure that it's like top notch. Now we're talking about these communities, these plantation sites that literally, like, they're in the middle of nowhere and they have tons of money, and these women were like bored out of their minds. Trust me, I read all their letters, and they're sitting there like, I gotta throw a ball. My son is not married and he's, you know, 16, and we have to figure this out really quickly. And so they had all of this angst around these catered events. And again, you can look at that and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But again, back up just a little bit. Who was making that food? If you burned the food, the mistress was not going to look good, right? So there was a lot of negotiation happening between these different people. Okay, myth number 1. Actually, this is probably not number 1. I know many of you are probably guilty of saying this. This is one of the ones. I actually watched a video of a Virginia plantation yesterday, and they gave into this thing. Kitchens were moved outside because of fire, right? All heard that? Right? Sure. Cool. Next, right? Like, that makes sense. I want you to think about that for a moment. And that idea came from this 1705 quote. All their drudgeries of cookery, washing, dairies, etc. are performed in offices attached from their dwelling houses, which by this means are kept more cool and sweet. You take this one funny little quote, right, and you run with it, right? You run with it really hard, just like that horrible mid-20th century portrait of the lady cooking. I think the next slide is correct. Hold on. Yes, awesome, okay. Sorry, when you do this talk so much, you forget which slideshow you have. I want you to count the chimneys on that house. There's 8, 16 fireplaces. Wintertime comes, oh, we can't have fire in the house. We'll burn down because brick burns down so easily. Right? There's just all kinds of things that you just start poking and you're like, wait a second, where is this coming from? This doesn't make any sense. Moreover, the idea of it not smelling good in the kitchen. We're talking about 1705. We're talking about the lack of bathing. I mean, give me a roasted goose or some gumbo any day over my husband's feet if he hasn't taken a bath in 3 months, right? So sometimes it just takes, it's not even like a PhD brain. You're just kind of like, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. But this all came from that quote, and it was really cemented into narratives in these plantation museums during the Jim Crow era, because they wanted to just quickly not talk about what was actually happening. By 1705, when that mention of the kitchen moving outside was sort of captured, you got a steep rise in the sort of influx of enslaved men coming into the colonies from West Africa. All right, so the fire thing is a big myth. Second myth that you see all over the place is these underground passageways that you see everywhere, right? These hidden passageways. Dumbwaiters as well, right? These are just the most like apolitical, boring things. They're cool, but they're not like racialized or politicized until you start thinking with your critical part of your brain, and you realize that when Thomas Jefferson came back from France, he brought with him this idea of a dumbwaiter. Again, dumb waiter. Who were the smart waiters? Who were the ones that were listening? They were the enslaved people that were at Monticello and other places. Bringing into, you know, a nation that was talking about ideas of freedom, right? You think of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. These conversations were happening at these diplomatic dinners, at these heads of states, you know, really important people's homes. You had people coming from all over the place, some of which definitely knew people like Jefferson was a slave owner, of course, right? But these allowed them to flex the visualization of that and to remove people out of the space, because there were also, during this time, not only was the United States getting ready to, you know, break away and like, you know, became its nation, you also have continual slave revolts happening throughout the diaspora. And trust me, the people on those plantations were terrified. So you've got the dumbwaiter, you have the hidden passageway, which really cracks me up because there was this sort of movement during the Revolutionary period up into the early, 1800s of having this, you know, sort of Palladian design. It makes sense, right? Beautiful, sort of Greek nod, you know, these little passageways that are built above ground. Sure, that's an architectural design that looks nice. It also, in some ways, helps mask the to and from the, you know, the kitchen service area into the house. And when people say to me, well, that was only because of architecture, I ask, why on earth then did you build underground passageways, which you see everywhere? This is Monticello. You see this whistling walk underground passage over there. That was from Berkeley Plantation. It's since, I think my book came out and they took it down immediately, bless their hearts. But the tour there, I'm sure a lot of you have been to that plantation. Like they talk about the wallpaper, they go out, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh yes, you know, the cook or the waiter had to whistle while they walked so they wouldn't eat the food. Again, it's like they're in there, and not only were they eating the food, they were this deep in biscuit dough, and they would be sometimes forced to eat the food because sometimes they were trying to poison people. So all of this is built out of this 1950s and 40s narrative that was very much solidifying the idea of Jim Crow. Okay. Now we're going to start talking about the cook. So I've sort of outlined, you know, the kitchen spaces, the function, the sort of macro level things. The cooks, now this is where my passion really sinks in. This is where the work that I did helped elevate those stories, helped bring them forth. I want to take you into this space and have you think critically about what was actually going on here. What you have here in the images, this is Mr. Payne. He was the son of an enslaved person at Stratford Hall. His name was Wesley, his father name was Bill, and he actually did food interpretation at Stratford Hall in the 1940s, absolutely incredible. And to the right here, we have Mr. Dontavius Williams, who does phenomenal foodways interpreting. So if any of you want to get him up here, he would do y'all proud. He is phenomenal. So in these spaces that were up until recently really thought of as these sort of neutral spaces, maybe it was easier working in there. It really wasn't. And as a professional chef, former professional chef, I interrogated the recipes And this was the worst day. So Colonial Williamsburg, I don't know, 15 years ago, I'm like, I'm gonna go and help Harold Caldwell cook in one of those kitchens. I'm gonna feel the heat of that fire. It was August. I put on my cute little skirt and was in there. I couldn't last 2 minutes in that heat. So the heat was absolutely out of control. They would have multiple fires going at once. More enslaved cooks died from burns than anybody else. They would also sometimes have to wet down their apron or their skirt to keep it from catching on fire. And of course, the bell system was going. So if you're someone like Caesar, who was the enslaved chef at Stratford Hall, you're there sleeping and the carters roll up at 3 a.m, you have to get up and start making that food. It was incredibly hard work. The meals that they produced were quite extravagant, really and truly. I would love to see any of these celebrity chefs try to do this in one of those kitchens. We actually had Chris Scott, who was a Top Chef finalist, come and try to cook on the hearth, and it was hilarious. He's like, "Where's the whisk?" And then Dontavia's hands on the little thing with the straw. I was like, here it goes. He had no idea what he was doing. So thinking about the skills and the ability to put on these meals, multiple sophisticated dishes, all at once on the open fire, absolutely incredible. So a typical meal would be, and supper would be sometime, in the evening or early afternoon, and you would have 3 courses if you're at one of these fancy homes with multiple things. So here you've got the first course, you have everything from fish, you've got mutton chops, you've got a saddle of mutton, again, you have soup, you've got pies, you've got, you name it is there, right? And then if you're still hungry, and again, all of this was about conspicuous consumption, right? Showing off your wealth through food. And then the second course, bring out even more food, right? You got pheasant, you got more pies, you've got jellied beets, etc. Cooking all of this on an open fire with no refrigeration, with no temperature control or anything is absolutely brilliant. And just to think about the quality of food that was being served is really, really incredible. Next slide, and then of course dessert. All right, but let's talk about the influence. This is where it got really fun. So who here has been to a historical society and gotten one of those old crusty cookbooks from the 18th century or 19th century, just open those things up? They smell like smoke. Maybe it's just because they're old, but they're kind of awesome, right? And so I, again, I'm getting my PhD, I'm real smart, I'm doing my thing. I went into those archives and I was like, give me the cookbooks. I didn't really say it like that, but they brought them out, and I didn't just look at the recipes and be like, oh, they were eating lamb. Yeah, duh. Of course they were eating these things. I looked at each recipe and thought about it from the mind and the eyes of the person that had to labor to cook it. You're planning your Thanksgiving meal. At some point, you're like, nope, that dish is not going to be on the table because I'm not cooking that in addition to everything else, right? These folks didn't have that choice. They had to cook whatever they were told. So when I started looking through these cookbooks, I first of all found the dirtiest pages, because we all know if you get someone's huge cookbook, that's the good stuff, right? You don't want the one that's creased that no one's looked at. You want that one that has notes on it, that has spaghetti sauce all over it. That's what you want. So I went through and I found that so many of these cookbooks had annotations and dirty marks on dishes like West African, food that you would see, like gumbo or okra stew. Tomato and okra stew is something that you see in Mary Randolph's cookbook, but other ones as well. You see one-pot meals like gumbo. You also see oyster stew, which is both Irish and British, as well as Gambian. So, oysters were very much a part of West African culture during that time. The only difference is there's dairy in the one from England, and there's a little tomato or pepper in the one from West Africa. And so you have these really African-rooted dishes being literally and figuratively written into the American cuisine, into the cookbooks. So things like also peanut stew. I hope with this crowd, you all knew what those pineapples were, so I'm hoping you got me on this one too. Yeah. Peanut soup, please, can I get a nod?
Oh yeah.
Okay, I gave a talk in Virginia a few weeks ago, and people looked at me like I was crazy, like peanuts. Yeah, I was like, and the age group was right, and I was like, come on, you remember. But back in the day, like 30 years ago even, you would be able to go to these little corner gas stations and they'd be serving up peanut stew. That is a West African recipe. So all of these things that we think of in jambalaya as well, these southern staples, are the essence of American food, and they are the essence of that relationship between these West Africans and their forced labor. Go ahead. Can't really see these, a bunch of white dudes with wigs, if you can't see. They represent sort of the breadth of the ways in which enslaved labor really fed not only conversations and our status, etc., and our dining tables, but things like the revolution. These men here are drinking liquor, right? One of the most popular liquors during this period was Madeira, made by enslaved labor in the Madeira Islands. They're drinking rum, which is a West African recipe that was born in 1645 in Barbados by West African enslaved folks. They're also drinking brandies that were made by the enslaved chef on a plantation, and they're smoking tobacco. Another thing, right, that was from the hands and the skill and the labor of these enslaved people. And I think about moments where you have to be brave, and liquor really helps with that, right? So I like to think that, you know, in so many ways, I mean, these guys were, not these guys, but the founding fathers, they were meeting in taverns and places and having really passionate conversations. You get some liquor in them and like, they're ready to go. So you gotta also give a little bit of a nod to the folks that were cooking all that stuff and making that stuff to provide that sort of liquid courage to have those bold movements actually happening. Next. I talked a little bit ago about that whistling walk and that fear of poison. This section of my book was incredibly depressing. I actually pause as I'm writing about it to list the names of people who were executed because they were accused of poisoning their enslaver. We're talking about pre-germ theory. We're talking about people getting sick from salmonella and things I didn't know about. Some of them, I guarantee, were on purpose, but a lot of them, I guarantee, were accidental, and it was this fear that was happening. So in the back of all those cookbooks I mentioned, it's recipes and then it's medicine. They were also making the tonics for the people who held them in bondage. They were also delivering the babies sometimes of the people, and you know, just all of those things that you get in the middle of nowhere. You've got your enslaved cook who's got all the tonics ready to go in the kitchen, and they're administering those things. One Tylenol will make your headache go away, right? A bottle will kill you. So you think about the difference between food and medicine. It's very, very, very thin, or I'm sorry, medicine and poison. One last thing about this, one of the moments where I think the greatest fear of being poisoned by enslaved cooks came about was after the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831. I swear the states around Virginia that had enslaved cooks did not eat from that kitchen for a good week. The letters written back and forth from the mistresses, they were terrified that they were going to be next. So you think about that power that those enslaved cooks had, not a lot, but it's enough to kind of give a little sharp eye to the person who was coming in there. And that's something that no other person on that plantation had the power to do. Next. Really quickly, one of the other myths that I sort of touched on when I was talking about Aunt Jemima in the earlier slides is that, you know, these West African folks that ended up in a big house were Uncle Toms, they were loyal, they did not care about the folks in the field. That is completely false. I have found, and others have found through archaeology, as well as talking to descendants of those folks, that they were absolutely connected to the people, not only in the field, but their ancestors back in West Africa. Images that you see here, the image that you see here is what's called the Congo cosmogram. It is a icon that was carved into objects throughout the African diaspora. Many of those different West African communities, like I said, had different religions, but many of them prayed differently, etc. But many of them thought of this cross, this X, as a mark that they would put on things to conjure their spirits of the ancestors for protection. So regardless of where they came from, many of them ended up using the Congo cosmogram, the X or the cross, to conjure spirits for protection in the colonies. And what you see evidence of not only this, but conjuring happening in the kitchens throughout Virginia and Maryland in particular. One example of this was found at Flower 200 Wilcox, kitchen during the Wilcox era. Somebody I was talking to earlier asked if my father was James Deetz. Yes, he was, and he dug this site in the 1980s before anybody that was doing this stuff knew anything about cosmograms or conjuring or any of it. So in that short period, and I'm getting old, so it's not that short to most people, but it's short to me now, in the last 40 years, so much work has been done to uncover what was actually found in these spaces. I, with my 21st century eyes, went through the collection during graduate school and found that there was a random bundle of shells and crystals that was found in the hearth of the kitchen. They didn't know what it was, and thank goodness they put it in a Ziploc and was like, I don't know what this is, and stuck it on a shelf at UVA. And 40 years later, with these new eyes, you can actually see evidence of these cooks not only like being connected to the spiritual world, but acting as root workers and conjurers in that space. This right here is a quick little picture of the White Sulphur Springs kitchen. This is in 1838, and if the lights were off, you could see it better. But these spaces, these kitchen spaces, were the axis of so many things, of culture, of creativity, of power, of pain, all of it. And there's also references that I found of enslaved people having their wedding ceremonies and parties afterwards in these spaces. So these kitchens that we see throughout the diaspora are so much to so many people, but there's so much more to African American folks than people realize. Next. I'm going to introduce you to a couple of chefs as I wrap this up. I'm sure all of you know who Chef James Hemmings is. He was the enslaved chef at Stratford Hall at Monticello, and his story is tragic. Most people know of him as the father of macaroni and cheese and all these wonderful stories. The ending of his life was I think, very indicative and representative of what it would have been like to be an enslaved chef during this period, even with all of his fame. So he was trained in Paris to cook in the French manner. He came back, negotiated his manumission with Thomas Jefferson. He trained his brother Peter to take on that reign, and he thought that he could go to Washington, D.C. and become a caterer, like he had heard of some other African-American folks that were doing well up there, working in different homes. So he went up there as a free man, and he couldn't get hired. No one wanted to hire a black man during that period to cook for them, even though he was Jefferson's chef. Even though people from all over the world knew how good his food was. And he ended up becoming an alcoholic, and he killed himself. So again, it's that romance of food, right? Everyone knows about that mac and cheese recipe. We talk about it every year. It's in the news, etc. No one talks about the pain of what this man went through. I'm going to tell you a different story that has a better ending than this, thank goodness. Next slide. I'm going to introduce you little Washington connection here, which I love, to Chef Hercules. This is not actually him on the right, but I still use the image because everyone thought it was him for so long, but I just pretend. We don't actually know exactly what he looked like, but we do know that he was born in 1754. He married a woman named Alice at Mount Vernon, who was who was a seamstress. And that's important, and I'll tell you why in a moment. They had 3 children. In 1786, at the age of 32, he was tapped as a skilled laborer to come in the kitchen and start learning how to cook with a man named Nate and a woman named Old Doll. And so he started training in this kitchen. He was so good and so quick that when Washington went to Philadelphia in late 1790, he tapped him to come up and learn a little bit more from a tavern keeper up there and be the presidential chef. I consider him, as many others, to be America's first celebrity chef. And I'll tell you why. One, he's cooking for the president. I mean, numero uno guy. Like, of course he's going to be really important. But it wasn't just that. It was his personality and what was remembered about him, which I'll get into in a moment. So he gets up there with a handful of folks from Mount Vernon, and then Washington, bless his heart, realizes that in the 1780s, Pennsylvania had put in place a Gradual Emancipation Act. Oops. That meant that anybody holding enslaved people had to free them within 6 months, period. So he wrote back and forth, really nervous, how am I going to be here during my term, etc. And then decided instead of doing the right thing, he just brought them back every 5 months and change to make sure that they touched Virginia's soil to then go back again. All of these trips that Chef Hercules made back and forth, I'm sure he met a lot of people on the back roads. He also was going into town. There was a vibrant and huge free Black community in Philadelphia during this period. He was cooking for heads of state from all over the world. This is that diplomatic cuisine that I mentioned. People knew who this guy was, so much so that, next slide, that Washington's step-grandson wrote a missive about him and talked about how, and I can only think of Gordon Ramsay when I hear this description, but how he, ran the kitchen like a tight ship, that at, when the clock struck, 5 o'clock, he'd be out the door and he'd be dressing up in all of his fine clothes. And this is where his wife, who passed away, by the way, I think this is where his wife kind of gave him a little touch, right? Like he had some style. So he had a nice triangle hat, he had silk stockings, he had the total outfit from top to bottom, he had a gold watch, and he even had a gold cane. And he would walk down Market Street in Philadelphia, which was the main street back then, and it still kind of is, and white men would bow to him. So he's going back and forth from quickly back to Mount Vernon and Virginia, all the way back up to this celebrity status. I'm sure people were whispering in his ears, etc. So fast forward a little bit, his time is gone. He's been selling his leftovers out of the back door for hundreds of dollars a year. This guy is famous. He is then, in 1796, returned back to Mount Vernon, and he is recorded as shoveling manure. Anyone would be pretty upset if you go from one extreme like that to the next. That was in November of 96, and George Washington, bless his heart, on his birthday in 1797 wakes up and goes and realizes that Hercules left. He escaped. And Ramin Ganeshram, who's a friend of mine and a historian, has found out that his name was Hercules Posey. He ended up in New York City, and he was a chef there and lived a wonderful free life for the rest of his life. So thinking about the differences between James Hemings and Hercules are vast, but they're also representative. Lastly, I'm going to introduce you to my friends on the right here who do, again, I'm always going to plug them. If you want anyone doing hearth cooking, these are fantastic interpreters. Nicole Moore, Dontavius Williams, Cheney McKnight. They were my left and right and middle hand, if I had one, at Stratford for all the work that we did. But I want to talk about the woman on the front of my book. Women get left out of a lot. Right? And there's a reason historically that, we pretty much just know about James Hemings as well as Chef Hercules, and we don't know about the women. The women were in there, towards the 19th century in ways that men were not. And this particular image I picked for the cover because she represents all of the enslaved women and other folks as well, but particularly women who were not written down in history. This is where, when I started out, my why I do this work, I wanted to have a representation of a real person who was in Amherst County, Virginia, captured by Penn here in 1855, as a representation of those people. And the man that did this, he did not, it was Hunter Strother, he did not say her name, he just said the cook. But he mentioned that she had, the wisdom of all, that she basically ran that site, that her children had the first dip in all gravies. And that little quote with this image speaks so loudly over the soft power and the importance. I'm going to end my talk by reading the last bit of Alice Walker's poem. Next slide. And I have to say, as someone who has 3 degrees in African American Studies, I almost passed out when she asked for my book. It was through Tanya Holland, who I was working on a cookbook with. She's like, I'm going to Alice Walker's house, I'm going to bring you a book. She wants to read it. And I was like, this is crazy. And then I get this picture sent to me, and I was like, she's not going to read it. And then I was like, oh my. A few months later, bam, she wrote a poem about it. And I was like, okay, I guess maybe this might have some sort of resonance with somebody. Like, I think I won. I'm good. Mic dropped. So I'm going to end, and the poem is beautiful, and it's long. And I'm going to read the last bit of it because, this work is representative of so many people and so many stories. And there's so much that you can get out of it, right? But I feel like she really captured a voice and a perspective that I didn't think of until she wrote this. And here's the end of the poem. And the poem is called, It's All About What We Do. But there she was, there she is, rising like one of her delicious cakes that mistress took dimpled credit for. Bound to the fire in the tiny room in which they made you cook and in which you yourself cooked, mother, grandmother, your daughters and granddaughters weep. Thinking of you captured for all your life in that small space before the open, blazing fire. No air conditioning, no breeze. What can we do? We can love you, venerate your memory, and work even now, so late in the day, for your total and global liberation. For we know you are not truly gone but exist somewhere this minute on somebody else's plantation. That knowing this, never forgetting, is part of what, to our souls, those ever-evolving mysteries, our own enslavement was for. Which is what Bound to the Fire, How Virginia's Enslaved Cooks Helped Invent American Cuisine by Kelley Fanto Deetz teaches us. Thank you. No questions? Yes?
If you were traveling in the southern part of the U.S., where would you anticipate you'd find the most?
I love that. In today's world, the question was, if you were traveling in the Southeast today, where would you find sort of the most authentic old food like this? I used to say Virginia, but I'm sorry, it's just, we gotta get together. I'm a Californian, but the state's gotta step it up a little bit. I was in Savannah 2 years ago, and I went to a restaurant called the Pink House or something like that. Oh, and I think it's African-American owned, and it's very much a nod to that old food, that old plantation food, and oh my goodness. And you're in an old plantation house and you're eating it, and it's empowering for many people because you're not eating at some stodgy old plantation. You're eating in a building that is owned and operated by a Black person, right, who's a chef, who's making this food in honor of their ancestors, and it just hits a little bit different. I would say Savannah is great. Charleston also, I think, is a really good place. When you think about earlier when I was talking, that 4% of people that ended up in British North America, they were also like, you could look at maps and look at the density of African descendant people in certain states. I would say the Carolinas and Georgia are really, really strong. New Orleans as well. New Orleans has a different vibe though, because of, the revolution and the French food and all that. But that's also very much Southern American food. That's also African diaspora food. And one of my favorite things to do is to travel in the diaspora and go to the Caribbean, right? And you go to a place that was colonized, let's say, by the English, like Barbados, and it was just the English until they had their independence. That food is as split down of West African and British food as you are ever gonna see. Right? They have things like macaroni pie. And it's like, why are you eating macaroni and pie? But it's got this spicy tomato sauce going on, right? You have pepper pot as well, and all these really interesting dishes. But then you go to a Spanish, Caribbean island, and then you have that Spanish kind of mixing in with that West African food. So, once you see the roots of West African cuisine, you can start seeing it sort of sprinkled throughout different areas throughout the different colonies. But thank you for that question. Yes.
Different sort of epiphanies and new ways of looking at things. How much pushback or resistance did you get from your colleagues?
I love a pushback question. I'll go back to my beginning of talking about how I interrogate the archive, I agitate people, and I just do. It's in my spirit. I grew up in Berkeley, California. My teachers were Black Panthers. I mean, I don't think you understand, like, the molecules in my body were activated at birth. And so it's everything in me sometimes not to push too much. I want to be sensitive to all of this history. Sometimes I really upset people when I talk about white ladies cooking in plantation kitchens. I wrote an article and I think I made a good, 24 enemies in one little release of this article. And all I was saying is it's just not authentic, like, you're not going to go to Plymouth Plantation and see a bunch of, like, like Japanese internment camp stuff happening. Like, it just doesn't make any sense, right? And so I've upset people because they're comfortable with what they thought they knew. And sometimes that is the hardest thing to wrap your brain around. So much of African American studies is pushing back. And not just like pushing back, because sometimes it's like, okay, cool, like I'll give you that, that makes sense. But it's reevaluating things. That's why looking at the archaeological material from the 1980s with 2020, eyes was really enlightening. That's why the work I did at Stratford, looking at the stuff that was there, that was literally mislabeled in an exhibit as something that it wasn't. It was actually West African and part of their religious practice. Like, it's pushing back, but it's also opening it up. So it's really how you present it. But, I have multiple times in my life stepped on toes, and I apologize. And, I just want a good conversation, and I just want the truth to be told. I love our country. I worked at Stratford Hall, the birthplace of Robert E. Lee. I have a background in Black studies. Like, do the math on that one. And I was there for years, and I didn't want the Lee stories to go away. They need to be bigger and better and talk about more of them besides 3. But, you have to balance out history. And for me, that should not be, it shouldn't be uncomfortable. Or we should be uncomfortable being comfortable being uncomfortable. Because anytime you retell a story, someone's going to get upset. But long story short, I've upset a fair amount of people. And I don't try to. I'm just trying to speak the truth. And maybe I'm wrong, and I'll be debunked in 10 years. I don't know. But I gave it my best. 1 and then 2.
How did you get interested in this particular topic?
Oh, so I was a chef for 10 years. My family's in the restaurant business. And my dad dragged me to Berkeley Plantation. Funny enough, it ended up being in my book. But he dragged me there when I was 17. He brought me out to Virginia. I'd never been out here before. It was bizarre to me and major culture shock. He took me to get peanut soup in the Surrey house or something over there. I grew up in Berkeley, urban girl, 100%. I thought someone had plopped me down in some kind of like Beverly Hillbilly thing. And I was terrified. And I'm not going to lie. I mean, it was really uncomfortable for me. Now I love it. I'm like, I would never go back to Berkeley. I'm here. Like, I'm ready to do this work here. But I remember at that point, I'd been working in restaurants for a few years because I grew up working in restaurants. And I was bored. I didn't want to do anything history. He was a professor, and I was bored of these tours he was making me go on. And then I got to Berkeley Plantation, and they're like, in the kitchen's over there. And I was like, oh, I could actually check that out. That's interesting. And immediately I had all these thoughts like, oh, who worked here? It wasn't interpreted at all. Fast forward, I'm in grad school, and I'm like, okay, I got to write a dissertation, and I got to write a book, and then what do I want to do, right? I literally got onto the Colonial Williamsburg Rockefeller Library from California and started looking at the ads for enslaved people being sold. And it says, like slaves as, baker, etc. All of a sudden, slaves as cooks. Pages and pages of ads with all of these details, trained in the French manner, can speak 2 languages. And I was like, whoa, this is wild. And then I was like, all I know is Aunt Jemima. And that's all anybody knew at that point. And so that's how it all started. And speaking of pushback, I had a fellowship at Colonial Williamsburg, my first of many there, and I presented my dissertation idea, and it was a room full of scholars, bless their hearts. That's already been done. We already know about this. And they just pushed back like crazy. And I thought to myself, okay, it's time to agitate. So I kept going and then found out a bunch of stuff that proved them wrong. So that was delicious. Hand it back. Yeah, mask and then, yes. She asked if the recipe books, the period ones, are accessible. When I was doing this work forever ago, I had to go and sit in the library. I'm pretty sure a lot of them are scanned. I think there's some, I know at UVA, they should be on their, in their that's William & Mary, small special collections. They should have some scanned there. But that's something I think it's worth a trip, and you just open it up and start looking through. They're pretty incredible. I'm sorry?
Tony Simpson Martin.
Yes, Tony Simpson Martin too. Did a whole book on that. In the back.
In our family, by the way, it isn't cookies, it's Aunt Elma's pound cake.
I love it.
Right, but these recipes are the cuisine, are the white slave owners eating it, not really acknowledging the background of the cook. What about the cooks? So let's say, I'll use the phrase black recipes. The lower cuts of meat. Did that ever make it to the owner's table?
I would say probably yes. The things that we think of, when you see these images of these dining room tables spreads, and you see things like head cheese, nobody in 2024 would be like, that would be on Jefferson's table for sure. That's high-class food. They were eating that stuff. They would stick the whole head of a calf, eyeballs and all, right in the middle of the table to show that they actually owned the thing that they killed, etc. The scraps and things were cooked in so many different ways, and archaeology has actually shown that in many communities, even the quarters, they weren't just eating the chitlins and stuff like that. They actually had different cuts of meat, because the cuts of meat that we think of now as being, high class were very different back then. So it changed over time. And so it was a mix. And of course, poor white folks were eating a lot of the same stuff that, enslaved folks were eating. I mean, it's just a fact. That's why when you use food in kitchens, historic kitchens, as a space to talk about the history of race, and you have people that are from lower economic backgrounds and of European descent coming into those spaces, they might have all kinds of ideas about Black folks. But immediately, and I've seen this happen time and time again, especially with Dontavius, they go in there and they come in and they're calling him boy and all kinds of crazy stuff. And then immediately he leans in and starts asking about what they liked growing up and their favorite recipe. And all of a sudden they're sitting there smelling the biscuits cooking and he's frying up some fish. And then quickly they realize that there's all these commonalities that they have in diet, and they start to break down the other things that were causing that initial tension. So food is such a powerful tool to have these kinds of conversations about class, about race, etc. Thank you for that question. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we hope you will all have a wonderful